The searchers saw it first as a dark shape against the endless white, a geometric anomaly that shouldn't exist this high on the mountain's shoulder. February 26, 1959. The military ski team had been climbing for hours through the frozen wasteland of the northern Urals when they found what remained of the expedition camp. What they discovered there would launch a mystery that refuses to die, even now, more than 6 decades later. The tent stood partially collapsed under fresh snow, its canvas sides whipping in the relentless wind that screamed down from the peak the locals called Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain. But it wasn't the location that stopped the rescuers cold. It wasn't the isolation or the savage temperatures that had plunged past -30 degrees. It was the tent itself. Someone had cut through it from the inside. Long, deliberate slashes ran through the heavy fabric, each one made by a blade wielded in panic, each one wide enough for a person to push through into the killing cold outside. The searchers approached slowly, their own breath crystallizing in the thin air. When they reached the tent, they found it still anchored, still standing despite the violence that had been done to it. Inside, the scene suggested an ordinary evening interrupted by something extraordinary. Boots lined up neatly by the entrance. Warm clothes folded and stacked. Food laid out as if for a meal that never happened. Personal belongings scattered but not ransacked. Cameras with film still loaded, waiting to tell a story their owners would never develop. And footprints. 9 sets of them, leading away from the tent in a rough line, heading downhill toward the tree line, more than a kilometer below. Bare feet and sock-clad feet, a few wearing only a single boot. The tracks told a story of people fleeing in whatever they wore at that moment, abandoning everything that might keep them alive in this frozen hell. No signs of struggle, no indication of what had driven them out. Just the slashed canvas and the footprints disappearing into the darkness below. The leader of this doomed expedition was Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student known for his meticulous planning and cool head in crisis. He had assembled a team of 8 others, all experienced winter hikers and cross-country skiers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. These weren't novices making rookie mistakes. They were elite outdoorsmen and women who had conquered difficult routes before, who knew the mountains intimately, who understood the line between calculated risk and suicide. They had set out in late January with a plan to reach Odertin Mountain, a route the Soviet Sports Committee classified as Category 3, the highest difficulty level. It was meant to be challenging, but achievable. They were supposed to send a telegram upon their return by February 12th. When that date passed in silence, no one worried immediately. Delays were common in the Urals. But when days stretched into weeks, search parties mobilized. What happened in the weeks that followed reads like something from a nightmare. The rescuers found the first 2 bodies near a cedar tree at the forest's edge, barefoot in the snow, wearing only underwear. Branches had been broken from the cedar, up to 5 meters high, suggesting someone had climbed it, looking for something or trying to escape something. A fire had been built there, its ashes still visible. Then 3 more bodies appeared along the slope between the cedar and the tent, including Igor Dyatlov himself, positioned as if they had been trying to crawl back to shelter. But the real horror came 2 months later when the spring thaw revealed the final 4 bodies buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine. These victims told a different story than the others. Massive internal trauma. Fractured skulls. Ribs broken with such force that the medical examiner compared it to a high-speed car crash. And stranger still, one victim was missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her facial tissue. Another was missing eyes. Yet their skin showed no external wounds that could explain these injuries. The official investigation concluded with a statement that has haunted researchers ever since. The hikers died, the report stated, from a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome. Then the case was closed. The files were sealed. The area was declared off-limits for 3 years, and the questions began to multiply like cells dividing in the dark. Over 60 years have passed since that tent was found slashed open on the mountain's slope. 60 years of theories, investigations, documentaries, and debates. 60 years of proposed explanations ranging from the scientifically plausible to the deeply disturbing. Some point to natural phenomena, rare atmospheric events that could explain the panic and the injuries. Others suggest military involvement, secret tests gone wrong, cover-ups extending to the highest levels of Soviet power. Some invoke the indigenous Mansi people and their warnings about the mountain. And some, in whispered conversations and late-night forums, speak of things that science hasn't named yet. Forces that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. We will explore 6 theories in the investigation ahead, each one attempting to solve pieces of this frozen puzzle. We'll examine the Avalanche hypothesis and why it fails to explain the evidence. We'll delve into secret military testing and the strange lights witnesses reported in the sky that night. We'll consider infrasound, a phenomenon that can drive people to madness without leaving a trace. We'll look at the possibility of hypothermia-induced paradoxical undressing and its darker implication. We'll investigate whether the Mansi people knew something about that mountain that the hikers dismissed. And we'll confront the theories that push beyond conventional explanation into territory that challenges our understanding of what's possible. Some of these explanations are more terrifying than others. But what truly haunts investigators is the growing realization that the truth might not be a single answer at all. It might be a convergence, a perfect storm of horrors that aligned on that particular night, on that particular mountain. Natural phenomena triggering human panic, triggering violence, triggering confusion in the dark. Each element feeding the next until 9 experienced hikers made choices that sealed their fate. The Dyatlov Pass incident, as it came to be known, represents something primal in our collective consciousness. It's a reminder that despite our technology and our knowledge and our confidence, there are still places where the rules we rely on simply don't apply. Places where our understanding fails. Places where 9 sets of footprints lead into darkness and never return. In the bitter cold of late January 1959, 10 young souls gathered at the Sverdlovsk train station, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air as they checked their equipment one final time. They were not ordinary students setting out on a casual winter holiday. These were experienced hikers, skilled skiers, and winter survival experts who had conquered some of the most challenging terrain the Ural Mountains had to offer. Their leader, Igor Dyatlov, was 23 years old, a 5th-year student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, with a radio engineering degree nearly in his grasp. He had designed and built much of the group's equipment himself, including a portable wood-burning stove that he believed would make their expedition more comfortable in the punishing cold. His reputation among the hiking community was that of a meticulous planner, someone who left nothing to chance, who triple-checked every detail before setting foot on a trail. Among the group was Zinaida Kolmogorova, known to everyone as Zina, a 22-year-old student with striking features and an infectious enthusiasm for the mountains. Her diary entries from previous expeditions revealed someone deeply connected to nature, someone who found peace in the wilderness that eluded her in the crowded cities. She had earned her hiking certification years earlier and had logged hundreds of miles across difficult terrain. Then there was Rustam Slobodin, another engineering student whose technical skills complemented Igor's leadership perfectly. He was known for his quick wit and his ability to maintain morale even when conditions turned brutal. Lyudmila Dubinina, called Lyuda by her friends, was perhaps the most passionate of all, a 20-year-old economics student who had spent every available weekend in the mountains since her teenage years. Her letters home spoke of an almost spiritual connection to the wild places, a need to test herself against the elements that her family never quite understood. The group also included 2 brothers in spirit, if not in blood, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonoshenko, both named Yuri but distinguished by their personalities. Doroshenko was quieter, more contemplative, while Krivonoshenko worked at a nuclear facility and brought a scientist's curiosity to every expedition. Alexander Kolevatov, a physics student, had joined the group more recently, but had already proven himself on several demanding winter treks. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, whose French surname hinted at ancestors from distant lands, was a civil engineering student with a reputation for strength and endurance. The youngest member was Yuri Yudin, whose fate would diverge from the others in a twist that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The final member was Semyon Zolotaryov, at 37 the oldest of the group by more than a decade, a veteran of World War II who had joined the expedition at the last minute, bringing with him a camera and stories from the front that kept the younger hikers entertained around campfires. Their objective was Otorten Mountain, a peak in the northern Urals that rose over 3,000 feet above the surrounding landscape. The name itself came from the Mansi language, meaning "don't go there," a warning that the group treated as mere folklore, the superstitious caution of indigenous people who lacked the technical skills and modern equipment that the Soviet hikers possessed. The route they planned would cover more than 180 miles through some of the most isolated wilderness in the Soviet Union, far from roads, villages, or any form of civilization. It was classified as a Category 3 hike, the highest difficulty rating, suitable only for the most experienced winter trekkers. Successfully completing it would earn them a certification that marked them as elite adventurers, members of a small fraternity who could claim mastery over the harshest conditions nature could produce. On January 27, 1959, the group boarded a train heading northeast from Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg, beginning a journey that would take them first by rail, then by truck, and finally on foot into the wilderness. Their spirits were high, captured in photographs that show young people laughing, making jokes, clearly confident in their abilities, and excited about the challenge ahead. These images, developed weeks later, would become haunting artifacts, the last glimpses of people who had no idea what awaited them. On January 28, they reached the town of Ivdel by train, then caught a truck to Vizhay, the last settlement before true wilderness began. Local residents who saw them remembered a boisterous, happy group, well-equipped and clearly experienced. Some of the older Mansi people in the area approached Igor, speaking in broken Russian about the mountain they intended to cross, warning him that Kolatsayakal was not a place for the living. The Mansi called it the Mountain of the Dead, a name that carried the weight of generations of oral tradition. According to the indigenous people who had hunted and herded reindeer across these lands for thousands of years, 9 Mansi hunters had perished on the mountain slopes in ancient times, killed by forces the legends never clearly define. Some stories spoke of lights in the sky, others of sounds that drove men mad, still others of winds that carried poison or spirits that fed on human warmth. The Soviet hikers, products of rational education and scientific thinking, smiled politely at these warnings, but gave them no serious consideration. They were children of the 20th century, equipped with down sleeping bags, waterproof tents, maps, compasses, and the collective wisdom of modern survival training. Superstition held no power over them. On February 1, 1959, the group began their ski trek from a logging camp at the base of the mountains. That same day, Yuri Yudin made a decision that would save his life but burden him with survivor's guilt for decades. He had developed severe joint pain and reluctantly concluded he could not continue. The group photographed him saying goodbye, images that showed genuine sadness at the parting but also confidence that they would all reunite in a few weeks to share stories of the journey. Yudin turned back, and the remaining 9 continued north toward Otorten. He was the last outsider to see them alive. Over the next days, the group's progress was documented in their journals and on film. Igor kept a meticulous group diary, noting distances covered, weather conditions, and the daily challenges of winter travel. Individual members kept personal journals as well, filled with observations, both practical and poetic. Lyudmila wrote about the beauty of frost-covered trees, about the way sunlight fractured through ice crystals to create rainbow halos. Zinaida sketched the landscape and noted the behaviors of the few animals they spotted. The photographs they took show increasingly harsh conditions, but also moments of joy, images of the hikers building snow shelters for practice, cooking meals over portable stoves, and posing together with snow-covered peaks in the background. By February 2nd, they had entered truly remote territory, pushing through deep snow with heavy packs, making slower progress than anticipated, but still within acceptable parameters for their planned route. The weather was deteriorating, with temperatures dropping well below freezing and winds increasing in intensity. On February 2nd, they prepared a supply cache, leaving extra food and equipment in a wooded area so they could make a faster push toward Otorten without the full weight of their packs. This was standard practice for experienced hikers, a way to ensure supplies for the return journey while enabling a summit attempt with lighter loads. The cache was carefully marked and documented in Igor's diary, proof of the methodical planning that characterized every aspect of the expedition. February 2nd was the last day anyone can definitively account for their movements and decisions. Though the timeline remains somewhat unclear, due to discrepancies in the diaries and later investigations. What is known is that the group began ascending the eastern slope of Paradoxical, deviating slightly from their planned route for reasons that have never been conclusively determined. Some researchers believe they veered off course due to worsening weather conditions and poor visibility. Others suggest Igor made a deliberate decision to take a more challenging route, perhaps to add difficulty to the trek and make their certification more impressive. Whatever the reason, they found themselves on the slope of the Mountain of the Dead as daylight began to fade and a brutal wind picked up intensity. The final photographs on their cameras show the group setting up camp on an exposed slope, rather than descending to the tree line where they would have found shelter from the wind and access to firewood. This decision has puzzled investigators for decades. These were not novices who might make such a fundamental error in judgment. Every manual on winter survival emphasizes the importance of camping in protected areas, yet here they were, pitching their tent on an open mountainside where wind could reach deadly velocities and temperatures could drop to levels that made survival a constant battle. Some of the last images show team members smiling despite the obvious difficulty of their situation, cutting blocks of snow to create a windbreak, securing tent lines against the gale. Inside the tent that night, crammed together for warmth, they ate a simple meal and made their final diary entries. The writing is casual, even lighthearted in places. Someone made a joke about the difficulty of the terrain. Another entry mentioned plans for the next day's push toward the summit. There is no hint of fear, no suggestion of anything unusual happening around them. These were people settling in for an uncomfortable but manageable night in conditions they had experienced many times before. The group even produced a mock newspaper, a tradition on their expeditions, filled with humorous articles and cartoons poking fun at each other's quirks and habits. This newsletter, found later among their possessions, showed people in good spirits, bonded by friendship and shared purpose. And then, at some point, in the darkness of that February night, something happened on the slopes of Paradoxical that would transform a routine winter hiking expedition into one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. Something that would cause 9 experienced winter survivors to tear their way out of their tent and flee into the lethal cold. Something that would scatter their bodies across the mountainside and leave evidence so contradictory and strange that decades of investigation would fail to produce a conclusive explanation. The Mountain of the Dead was about to claim 9 more souls, and the manner of their deaths would suggest that perhaps the ancient Mansi warnings carried more truth than Soviet science was prepared to acknowledge. The snow remembers everything. It remembers weight and pressure, angle and instability. And on the night of February 1st, 1959, the snow on the slopes of Paradoxical may have remembered something else: how to kill. For decades, investigators pushed the avalanche theory aside, dismissing it almost immediately. The reasons seemed obvious at first glance. There was no massive debris field, no towering wall of snow that had clearly swept down from above and buried the tent. The slope itself seemed too gentle, too moderate for such a catastrophic event. Search parties arriving weeks later found the tent still partially standing, its canvas sliced open from the inside with what appeared to be careful, deliberate cuts. The scene didn't match what anyone expected from an avalanche. It looked like escape, not burial. But science has a way of circling back, of re-examining old assumptions with new tools. In the past 15 years, the avalanche theory has experienced a remarkable resurrection, powered by computer modeling, biomechanical analysis, and a deeper understanding of a specific type of snow disaster, the delayed slab avalanche. The theory begins with the location itself. The Dyatlov group made a decision that night that has puzzled experts ever since. Instead of camping below the tree line in the relative safety of the valley, they cut into the slope of the mountain to create a level platform for their tent. They dug into the snow, creating what's called a cut, a flat surface carved into the incline. At the time, this seemed like reasonable practice, a way to gain altitude and save time for the next day's trek. But that cut, that single modification to the snowpack, may have set into motion a chain of events that wouldn't conclude for hours. Modern snow science has revealed something terrifying about certain types of avalanches. Unlike the dramatic cascades we see in movies, walls of white thunder roaring down a mountainside, slab avalanches can be subtle, insidious, and delayed. The mechanics are deceptively simple yet deadly. When snow accumulates on a slope, it forms layers, each with different densities and crystal structures. Sometimes, a weak layer forms beneath a stronger, more cohesive slab. This creates a loaded gun, a disaster waiting for a trigger. The trigger doesn't have to be immediate. Temperature changes, wind patterns, the slow creep of gravity. These forces can work on the snowpack for hours, gradually stressing the weak layer until it reaches a critical failure point. The hikers cut into the slope sometime in the late afternoon or early evening. They set up their tent, ate their dinner, and settled in for the night. According to the diaries found later, their spirits were good despite the brutal cold and wind. They joked, they sang, they prepared for sleep in the cramped confines of their canvas shelter. And while they slept, the snow above them was changing. Computer modeling conducted in 2020 by researchers in Switzerland and Russia has demonstrated that the conditions on Catastrophes that night were nearly perfect for a delayed slab avalanche. The team used data about the slope angle, which was between 20 and 30 degrees, the snow depth, the wind patterns, and the temperature fluctuations. They ran thousands of simulations, and in a significant percentage of them, the cut made by the hikers, combined with the weight of accumulated snow driven by katabatic winds coming down the mountain, created enough stress to trigger a collapse. But not right away. The simulations showed that such an avalanche could occur hours after the initial disturbance, typically between 9 and 12 hours later. If the hikers made their cut around 5 or 6 in the evening, a collapse at midnight or later fits perfectly within this window. Picture it. 9 people sleeping in a tent, packed tightly for warmth against temperatures that have dropped to somewhere near minus 30 degrees Celsius. The wind howls constantly, a sound they've grown accustomed to over days of trekking. And then, without warning, the slope above them fails. A slab avalanche doesn't necessarily mean millions of tons of snow. It can be a relatively small event, a section of compacted snow perhaps 30 to 50 meters wide and only 1 to 2 meters thick. But when that much snow moves suddenly, when it slides even a short distance before coming to rest, the force is immense. The pressure wave alone can be devastating. The modeling suggests that a slab struck the tent from the upslope side, collapsing it partially, and trapping the occupants beneath both the canvas and a layer of heavy, compacted snow. This would explain the panic, the desperate need to escape immediately. In complete darkness, in temperatures that could kill in minutes, buried under snow that was suffocating them, the hikers did the only thing they could. They cut their way out from the inside. This is where the theory starts to gain traction with the physical evidence. The cuts in the tent were indeed made from the inside, long slashes through the canvas. Investigators originally saw this as evidence against an avalanche, reasoning that people would simply exit through the tent's entrance. But anyone who has experienced the disorientation of sudden burial, the crushing weight, the inability to determine which direction is up or where the door might be, understands that panic drives different choices. You cut toward air, toward any escape, toward survival. Once free of the tent, the group faced an impossible situation. They were not dressed for the cold. Several were in socks or barefoot, others in light clothing they'd worn to sleep. Their boots, their heavy coats, their survival gear, all of it was buried in or under the collapsed tent. And here's the critical point. If the slope had just avalanched once, it could avalanche again. Digging through the tent to retrieve their gear might trigger another collapse. Standing on that slope for any length of time was potentially suicidal. So they ran. They fled down the slope toward the tree line, toward the forest that lay over a kilometer away. It was a desperate gamble, trading the immediate danger of the unstable slope for the slower danger of hypothermia. They likely believed they could reach the trees, build a fire, and perhaps return to the tent once they'd warmed up and the slope had stabilized. We know they made it to the trees. We know they built a fire. And we know that for most of them, it wasn't enough. But the avalanche theory offers more than just an explanation for the flight from the tent. It also addresses one of the most puzzling aspects of the case: the injuries. 4 of the hikers, the ones found months later in the ravine, had suffered massive trauma. Lyudmila Tibinina had major chest fractures and was missing her tongue. Alexander Zolotaryov had severe chest injuries. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had a fractured skull. Semyon Zolotaryov's chest damage was so severe that the medical examiner compared it to the trauma from a high-speed car crash. These were not injuries from a fistfight or a fall. The force required was enormous, yet there were no external wounds, no cuts or abrasions that would indicate a fall onto rocks or an attack by weapons. The medical examiner noted that the injury suggested a powerful, crushing force, something like a shockwave or intense pressure. An avalanche, even a relatively small one, delivers exactly this type of force. The snow doesn't need to bury someone completely to cause fatal injuries. The impact of a moving slab, or being caught between the sliding snow and an immovable object like a rock or frozen ground, can crush a human body with terrifying efficiency. The fact that the four with the worst injuries were found in a ravine, a place where they might have sought shelter or fallen while trying to dig a snow cave, fits with the possibility that they were caught by a secondary snow slide or that the original avalanche had struck them as they fled. Recent biomechanical analysis has compared the injuries to those sustained in avalanche accidents documented in more recent decades. The pattern matches. Severe internal trauma, broken ribs, crushed organs, but relatively intact skin and bone structure on the surface. It's the signature of snow-related crushing injuries. The theory seems to come together. The slope, the cut, the delayed collapse, the desperate flight, the injuries. Each piece supports the next, building a narrative that feels almost complete. But then the doubt creeps in, quiet and persistent as the wind on that mountain. Where is the avalanche debris? Search parties arrived at the tent site on February 26th, nearly a month after the incident. They found the tent damaged and partially collapsed, but they didn't report any significant avalanche debris. There was no clear run-out path, no disturbed area above the tent that would indicate where the slab had broken free. The snow around the tent looked relatively undisturbed. If an avalanche had struck with enough force to cause fatal injuries and trigger a panicked evacuation, shouldn't there be more evidence? Shouldn't the snow tell that story more clearly? Some researchers argue that wind and additional snowfall in the intervening weeks could have obscured the evidence, smoothing over the debris field and hiding the fracture line. Others point out that small slab avalanches can be remarkably difficult to detect after the fact, especially if the slab was thin and didn't travel far. But the uncertainty remains, a gap in the narrative that refuses to close. Then there's the question of the cuts themselves. Yes, panic can explain cutting through the tent to escape, but witnesses who examined the tent described the cuts as surprisingly straight, deliberate, methodical. Some of the cuts were quite long, nearly a meter in length. Does that sound like the frantic slashing of people being crushed and suffocated? Or does it suggest something else? Something more controlled, more purposeful? And perhaps most troubling of all, why would experienced hikers camp there in the first place? Igor Dyatlov was the group's leader, a seasoned outdoor enthusiast who had led multiple winter expeditions. The others were equally experienced, certified hikers who understood mountain safety. They would have known the risks of camping on a slope, of cutting into a snowpack in avalanche terrain. The standard practice, drilled into every winter mountaineer, is to camp on flat ground, preferably below the tree line, away from any slope that could slide. Yet, they chose to dig into the mountainside. They chose to spend the night on a slope that, according to the modern theory, was primed to kill them. Why? Did they misjudge the danger? Did exhaustion or poor visibility lead them to make a fatal error? Or did something else influence their decision, something we don't yet understand? The avalanche theory has been revived, refined, and supported by modern science. The computer models work. The injury patterns match Dyatlov. The timeline makes sense, but the questions remain, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The snow remembers everything, they say. But what it remembers about the night of February 1st, 1959, it isn't telling. The human body is a remarkable machine, evolved over millions of years to protect itself from countless threats. But extreme cold presents a unique challenge, one that can twist our most basic survival instincts into something that looks, from the outside, like madness itself. When rescue teams found the bodies scattered across the snow-covered slopes of Kolat-Syakhl in the weeks following the disappearance of the Dyatlov group, they encountered a scene that defied immediate explanation. Some of the hikers were found in states of undress that seemed to mock the very conditions that had killed them. This wasn't simply carelessness or panic. This was something stranger, something that would force investigators to confront one of the most paradoxical phenomena in cold weather survival. The first two bodies discovered were those of Yuri Krivonashenko and Yuri Doroshenko, found beneath a cedar tree nearly a mile and a half from the tent. Both men were dressed only in their underwear. Their bare feet had traveled across snow and ice. Their hands showed signs of having climbed the cedar, breaking branches, perhaps attempting to see back toward the tent or searching for any sign of rescue. Around them lay the remains of a small fire, barely sufficient to warm a single hand, let alone save a life in temperatures that had dropped well below -25 degrees Celsius. The positioning of their bodies, the minimal clothing, the inadequate fire, all spoke to a final desperate attempt at survival that was doomed from the start. Paradoxical undressing, as it's known in medical literature, was not widely understood in 1959, though it had been observed before. The phenomenon occurs in the late stages of severe hypothermia, typically when core body temperature drops below 30 degrees Celsius. As the body loses heat, blood vessels in the extremities constrict, pulling warmth toward the vital organs in a last-ditch effort to keep the heart and brain functioning. This vasoconstriction can continue for some time, but eventually, the muscles controlling these blood vessels become exhausted. They fail. When they do, there's a sudden rush of blood back toward the skin's surface. This creates an overwhelming sensation of heat, a burning warmth that feels completely real to the dying brain. Victims become convinced they're overheating. They tear at their clothes, stripping away the very insulation that might save them, desperate for relief from a heat that exists only in their failing nervous system. 3 more bodies were found between the cedar tree and the tent. Rustem Slobodin, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Igor Dyatlov himself appeared to have been attempting to return to the shelter when they succumbed to the cold. They were more fully dressed than the 2 Yuris, but their clothing was still inadequate, still disheveled. The positions of their bodies suggested they had fallen and simply not risen again. Dyatlov was found with 1 boot off. Kolmogorova had burns on her hands and pieces of cloth that didn't match her own clothing. The evidence suggested they had been at the fire or had taken items from the others before attempting the climb back up the slope. They had died at intervals, each one a little closer to the tent than the last, as though the mountain was collecting them one by one. The physical progression of hypothermia helps explain their behavior, if not the initial flight from the tent. In the first stage, as core temperature drops from normal to around 35 degrees Celsius, victims experience intense shivering, confusion, and difficulty with fine motor skills. Fingers become clumsy. Decision-making becomes impaired. This could explain why the hikers cut their way out of the tent rather than properly opening it, why they fled without properly dressing, why they made choices that would seem obviously fatal to someone in a normal state of mind. As the temperature continues to drop into the moderate hypothermia range, between 32 and 35 degrees, shivering may actually stop. Muscle coordination deteriorates dramatically. Speech becomes slurred. Memory fails. Apathy sets in, a dangerous indifference that makes even simple survival tasks feel impossible. But it's in the severe stage, below 30 degrees, that the real psychological breakdown occurs. This is where hypothermia doesn't just affect the body, but fundamentally alters perception and cognition. The condition, sometimes called hypothermic psychosis, can create vivid hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and behaviors that appear completely irrational to outside observers. Victims have been known to burrow into small spaces, a phenomenon called terminal burrowing, driven by some primitive instinct to seek shelter, even when that shelter makes no practical sense. They've been found hiding in closets, crawling under beds, wedging themselves into spaces where they would eventually die. Others experience what could only be described as a complete break from reality, seeing things that aren't there, fleeing from imagined threats, acting on impulses that their dying brains present as urgent and necessary. Search and rescue professionals have documented cases where hypothermic victims became aggressive toward rescuers, convinced that the people trying to save them were attacking them. Others have walked away from functioning shelters, removed their clothes in full view of safety, or made elaborate but meaningless efforts to arrange objects around them. The cold doesn't just kill the body. It rewrites the very software of consciousness, creating a nightmare state where the victim's perception of reality becomes utterly unreliable. Could this explain what happened on the mountain? The scenario seems to fit in several ways. Imagine the hikers fleeing the tent for reasons we'll examine shortly. Within minutes in that extreme cold, inadequately dressed, hypothermia would have begun its work. Confusion would have set in quickly. The decision to travel all the way to the tree line, over a mile away, rather than immediately returning to the tent, suggests impaired judgment from the very beginning. The fire they built was hopelessly inadequate, but to minds slipping into hypothermic confusion, it might have seemed like a reasonable solution. As the cold deepened its grip, paradoxical undressing would have claimed the two Urus. Perhaps the others, still capable of some rational thought, took clothing from their dying companions, trying to keep themselves alive. The attempt to return to the tent would have been made by those who retained enough mental function to recognize the need for shelter, but by then their bodies had been too damaged by the cold. They fell, one by one, and the mountain covered them with snow. The last 4 bodies, found months later in a ravine beneath several meters of snow, present a more complicated picture, but hypothermia might still play a role. These victims, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Zolotaryov, were more substantially dressed than the others. Some wore clothing that had been taken from the bodies near the cedar tree, strips of fabric wrapped around feet, sweaters that had belonged to the dead. This suggested a longer period of survival, a more organized attempt to stay alive. But they had died anyway, and their bodies bore injuries that seemed inconsistent with simple exposure. Yet even here, hypothermia and its psychological effects could offer partial explanations. Victims in the grip of severe hypothermia have injured themselves badly, falling from heights they would normally navigate easily, stumbling into hazards they would typically avoid. The ravine where the 4 were found was not immediately visible in the snow and darkness. A group of confused, hypothermic individuals could have fallen or stumbled into it, sustaining injuries in the process. Some researchers have suggested that the weight of accumulated snow collapsing into the ravine could have caused the chest and skull fractures documented in the autopsy reports, particularly if the bodies had lain there for weeks before being found. The hypothermia theory is compelling because it's grounded in established medical science. We know paradoxical undressing occurs. We know cold-induced psychosis is real. We know that people in the grip of severe hypothermia do things that seem incomprehensible to the outside observer. The scatter pattern of the bodies, the states of undress, the inadequate fire, the seemingly irrational decisions, all of these fit within the known effects of extreme cold exposure. But the hypothermia explanation, as neat as it seems, leaves critical questions unanswered. Questions that have kept this case alive in the public imagination for over 60 years. The most fundamental problem is the initial flight from the tent. Hypothermia explains what happened after they left, but it doesn't explain why they left in the first place. The tent was cut from the inside, suggesting desperate haste to escape. The hikers fled without proper clothing, without boots, into a night of deadly cold and darkness. This wasn't a gradual deterioration of judgment. This was immediate, urgent panic. What could cause 9 experienced winter hikers, people who understood the dangers of the environment intimately, to abandon their only shelter in such conditions? Hypothermia hadn't set in yet. They were warm, they were protected. Something drove them out, into the lethal cold, and that something remains unexplained. The injuries present another significant challenge. While hypothermia can cause falls and accidents, the specific nature of some injuries strains the hypothesis. Dubinina's chest fractures were described by the medical examiner as consistent with massive force, comparable to a car accident. Her tongue and eyes were missing, though this could potentially be explained by natural decomposition and scavenging. Thibault-Brignol's skull fracture was severe. These weren't simple slips and tumbles. If the ravine collapse theory is invoked, why weren't the injuries more uniform? Why did some bodies show such trauma while others didn't? There's also the pattern of behavior that suggests at least some of the group retained rational thought for a significant period. The clothing exchange, the fire building, the attempted return to the tent. These aren't the actions of people entirely lost to hypothermic psychosis. They suggest purposeful, if ultimately futile, survival efforts. This creates a puzzle. If they were rational enough to make these attempts, why didn't they make the most rational choice of all, and return to the tent immediately? The investigation at the time noted unusual circumstances that don't fit neatly into the hypothermia framework. Some clothing showed traces of radiation, though at levels that might have been from natural sources or contamination during the investigation itself. The last photographs from the group's camera showed strange lights in the sky, though these could have been lens flares or long exposures. Witnesses in the area reported unusual aerial phenomena around the time of the incident. While these details might be coincidental or misinterpreted, they suggest a more complex situation than simple exposure. The hypothermia theory, then, is both the most scientifically grounded explanation and also fundamentally incomplete. It explains the how, but not the why. It accounts for the progression of events once the hikers were exposed to the cold, but it cannot tell us what began that fatal sequence. Was there an avalanche that never left clear evidence? A military accident covered up by authorities? An encounter with hostile individuals? Some natural phenomenon they misinterpreted in their panic? The initial cause remains the mystery that keeps the case open, the unanswered question that transforms a tragic story of cold weather deaths into something that feels darker, stranger, more unsettling. What we're left with is a documented demonstration of what extreme cold can do to the human body and mind, wrapped around a central void where an explanation should be. We can trace the final hours with medical precision, understanding each choice and action through the lens of failing physiology. But that first choice, that moment when survival instinct should have kept them in the tent, but instead sent them fleeing into the darkness, remains hidden from us, preserved in ice and silence, on a mountain that has never given up all its secrets. In the decades following that frozen February night of 1959, countless theories have attempted to explain what drove 9 experienced hikers to tear through the walls of their tent and flee barefoot into the killing cold of the Ural Mountains. But in 2013, a researcher named Donnie Eichar proposed something that would fundamentally challenge how we understand the Dyatlov Pass incident. His theory did not involve conspiracies or exotic weapons or violent attackers. Instead, it pointed to something far more insidious, an invisible force that may have literally driven the hikers mad with terror. Eichar suggested that the mountain itself had become a weapon, generating a phenomenon called a Kármán vortex streak that created infrasound waves powerful enough to induce mass psychological breakdown. To understand this theory, we must first understand what infrasound actually is. Sound waves exist on a spectrum, and human beings can typically hear frequencies between 20 and 20,000 hertz. But below that 20 hertz threshold lies infrasound, frequencies too low for our ears to consciously detect yet still capable of affecting our bodies in profound and disturbing ways. These waves exist all around us. Earthquakes produce them. Ocean waves crashing against coastlines generate them. Animals like elephants and whales use infrasound to communicate across vast distances. And under certain meteorological conditions, mountains can create them too. The effects of infrasound on the human body have been documented in numerous studies. Researchers have found that exposure to these low-frequency waves can trigger intense feelings of anxiety and dread. Test subjects report sensations of pressure in their chests, difficulty breathing, and an overwhelming conviction that something terrible is about to happen. At certain frequencies, particularly around 19 hertz, infrasound can cause the human eyeball to resonate, creating visual distortions and hallucinations. People exposed to these frequencies have reported seeing shadow figures, distorted faces, and movement in their peripheral vision. The effects can include disorientation, nausea, panic attacks, and in extreme cases, a complete loss of rational thought. What makes infrasound particularly terrifying is that victims cannot identify the source of their fear. They experience pure, unexplained terror with no visible threat to rationalize it. Eichar's journey to this theory began with meteorological data. While researching his book about the Dyatlov incident, he obtained weather records from the night of February 1st and 2nd, 1959. The data revealed that conditions on Catastrophes, the mountain where the hikers camped, were severe but not unprecedented. Winds were strong, blowing at approximately 40 to 50 miles per hour across the mountain's ridge. The temperature had dropped to somewhere between -25 and -30 degrees Celsius. But here's where Eicher's research became fascinating. He noticed that the topography of the slope where the hikers pitched their tent created a specific aerodynamic situation. The mountain's geography forms what engineers call a bluff body, a dome-like obstacle that disrupts smooth airflow. When wind encounters such an obstacle, it doesn't simply flow smoothly over and around it. Instead, under the right conditions, the wind creates alternating vortices, swirling patterns of air that detach and flow downwind in a specific formation. This phenomenon is known as a Kármán vortex street, named after the aerospace engineer Theodor von Kármán, who first described it mathematically. These vortex patterns are common in nature and engineering. You can see them in cloud formations. They form behind bridge supports in rivers. They're responsible for the singing of power lines in strong winds, and the eerie howling that wind makes through certain architectural structures. When a Kármán vortex street forms, it generates powerful low-frequency pressure waves, infrasound.io. The frequency of these waves depends on the size of the obstacle and the wind speed. Eicher worked with aerospace and acoustic experts to model the conditions on Catastrophes that night. The calculations suggested that the mountain's profile, combined with the sustained wind speeds, could have generated infrasound in the range of 6 to 12 Hz, well below the threshold of human hearing, but precisely in the range most likely to affect human physiology and psychology. Even more intriguingly, this phenomenon would not have been constant. Kármán vortex streets require specific, sustained conditions. The infrasound might have built up over hours as the hikers tried to sleep, creating an increasingly unbearable psychological pressure. Imagine being inside that tent. The canvas walls are snapping and rippling in the wind. The temperature is brutal, but you're huddled in your sleeping bag trying to rest for the next day's trek. And then, slowly, something begins to feel wrong. Your chest tightens. Your breathing becomes difficult. You feel pressure in your skull. The shadows cast by your flashlight seem to move unnaturally. Your companions' faces look distorted, threatening. The anxiety builds and builds with no rational explanation. You can't hear the infrasound itself, so you have no way to understand that the mountain is essentially playing your nervous system like an instrument. All you know is that staying in this tent feels impossible, that remaining here means death, that you must flee immediately or something unspeakable will happen. This is where the theory of mass hysteria enters the picture. Mass psychogenic illness, as it's formally known, occurs when groups of people develop similar physical or psychological symptoms without an identifiable organic cause, or when the symptoms are disproportionate to any actual threat. History is filled with examples. In 1962, a mysterious outbreak of laughter in Tanzania spread from 3 girls to 95 students, forcing the temporary closure of a school. In the 19th century, entire factories would experience waves of fainting and seizures. More recently, mysterious symptoms have spread through schools when students become convinced they've been exposed to toxins. The key factor in mass hysteria is a shared stressful environment and mutual reinforcement of fear responses. Now imagine that stressful environment amplified by actual physiological effects from infrasound. The hikers were already in a challenging situation, camping on an exposed mountainside in winter condition. If infrasound began affecting them, the terror wouldn't have been experienced in isolation. One person's panic would feed another's. Someone's hallucination would seem to confirm another's fear. The group dynamics would create a feedback loop. When one person decided they had to leave the tent immediately, others would interpret that action as confirmation of danger. The decision to cut through the tent walls, rather than use the entrance, suggests desperate, irrational panic. It suggests people who were not thinking clearly, who were operating on pure fight-or-flight instinct. Eicher's theory gained significant traction when it was published, and it's easy to understand why. It provides a rational, scientific explanation for seemingly inexplicable behavior. It doesn't require conspiracies or cover-ups. It explains why experienced hikers would make decisions that seem utterly irrational, why they would flee without proper clothing into conditions they knew would kill them. The theory accounts for the bizarre circumstances while remaining grounded in known phenomena. Infrasound is real. Its effects on human psychology are documented. Karma and vortex streets exist and can be predicted based on topography and weather conditions. The pieces fit together in a way that feels satisfyingly complete. But does it actually explain everything? This is where the theory begins to show its limitations. First, there's the question of coordination. Yes, panic can drive people to flee, but the evidence suggests some level of organized action after leaving the tent. The footprints discovered by searchers showed that the group moved together down the slope in relatively orderly fashion initially. They made it nearly 1.5 miles to the forest edge. Some of them built a fire. They dug a snow den. These actions suggest that at least some rational thought was occurring. Would people in the grip of infrasound-induced panic be capable of these coordinated survival efforts? Or would the effects have diminished once they moved away from the specific zone where the Kármán vortex was generating infrasound? Then there are the injuries, the aspect of the case that has always been most difficult to explain. 3 of the hikers, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Alexander Kolevatov, were found with massive internal trauma. Dubinina's chest injuries were so severe that multiple ribs were broken and her heart was damaged. Zolotaryov suffered similar devastating chest trauma. The medical examiner compared the force required to create these injuries to that of a high-speed car crash. Infrasound, no matter how intense, cannot break ribs. It cannot create blunt force trauma of that magnitude. So either something else happened after the hikers fled the tent, or the infrasound theory is incomplete. Some supporters of the infrasound hypothesis argue that the injuries could have occurred separately, perhaps from a fall or a collapsed snow den. The ravine where these bodies were found was several meters deep, and a fall onto rocks or ice could potentially explain some trauma. But the specific pattern of injuries, particularly the severe chest trauma without corresponding external wounds, remains difficult to account for. The medical examiner was clear that these were not injuries from a fall. They required sustained, massive pressure to the chest cavity. There's also the question of whether the meteorological conditions that night were truly sufficient to generate the sustained Kármán vortex street necessary for this effect. While Aker's modeling suggested it was possible, actual confirmation would require extensive field testing under similar conditions, something that has not been definitively conducted. Mountains create complex wind patterns, and while the theory is plausible, proving that it actually occurred that specific night remains speculative. Despite these limitations, the infrasound theory remains one of the most compelling rational explanations for the Dyatlov Pass incident. It addresses the central mystery: why experienced hikers would flee their only shelter in deadly conditions, without requiring exotic or conspiratorial explanations. It provides a mechanism for the terror that clearly gripped the group, and it reminds us that nature possesses forces we barely understand, frequencies and phenomena that can affect us in ways we cannot consciously perceive. The mountain may not have been haunted by spirits or used as a weapons testing ground, but under the right conditions, it may have become something just as terrifying, an instrument playing a song of madness that only the body could hear, while the mind tried desperately to understand why it suddenly felt the need to run into the frozen darkness, away from safety, toward certain death. The Cold War was not fought only in the shadows of Berlin or the jungles of Southeast Asia. It was fought in laboratories, in remote testing ranges, and in the vast, frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains. By the late 1950s, this mountain range had become one of the most secretive military corridors in the entire Soviet Union, a place where the boundaries between acceptable risk and human expendability grew dangerously thin. On the night of February 1st, 1959, when 9 hikers died under circumstances that still defy complete explanation, they were not alone in that wilderness. Others were watching the skies that night. Others saw things that would haunt their memories for decades to come. Approximately 50 kilometers south of Kolatsiakal, a group of meteorology students had set up camp for their own expedition. These young scientists were studying atmospheric conditions, recording wind speeds and temperature fluctuations in the brutal Ural winter. Around 9 o'clock that evening, one of them stepped outside the tent to check their instruments. What she saw made her call to the others immediately. There, moving slowly across the northern sky, were orange spheres of light. Not one but several, glowing with an intensity that seemed to pulse and shift. They moved with purpose, she would later testify, not randomly like natural phenomena. They appeared to be under some form of control. The students watched these lights for nearly 20 minutes before they disappeared beyond the mountain ridges, heading in the direction of what would later be identified as the area where the Dyatlov group had made their final camp. These students were not alone in their observations. A worker at a lumber camp reported similar phenomena to his supervisor that same night. A truck driver traveling the remote roads of the region claimed to have seen bright orange lights descending toward the mountains. Even more significantly, residents of the village of Vichy, located roughly 50 kilometers from the incident site, reported seeing strange illuminations in the sky during that same time period. For years, Soviet authorities dismissed these accounts as misidentifications of natural phenomena. Perhaps the northern lights, they suggested. Perhaps reflections from ice crystals in the atmosphere. But the witnesses insisted otherwise. They knew what the aurora borealis looked like. They had lived their entire lives in these northern latitudes. What they saw on February 1st was something entirely different. When the search party finally discovered the bodies weeks later, military personnel arrived at the scene with unusual speed. Investigators from Sverdlovsk appeared, yes, but so did others whose credentials and purpose remained deliberately vague. Some searchers reported seeing men in military uniforms conducting their own investigation, separate from the official civilian effort. These military observers took particular interest in the condition of the bodies and the surrounding area, examining the scene with equipment that seemed far more sophisticated than standard forensic tools. One detail that struck multiple witnesses as suspicious was the presence of detection equipment being used around the bodies and the tent site. Several searchers described seeing investigators sweeping devices across the ground and over the victims' clothing. When asked about this, the military personnel provided no explanation and ordered the civilian searchers to maintain a specific distance from certain areas of the scene. Then came the radiation finding. When the bodies were finally transported to Sverdlovsk for examination, medical examiner Boris Vozrozdeny conducted thorough autopsies. During this process, samples of clothing from several victims were sent for radiological analysis. The results showed elevated levels of radioactive contamination on specific items. The clothing belonging to Krivonyshenko and Dubinina showed particularly high readings. The levels detected were not enormous, but they were undeniably above normal background radiation. The official explanation suggested the contamination might have resulted from the victims' professional work. Krivonyshenko had worked at the Mayak nuclear facility, a plutonium production plant, in the southern Urals. Perhaps, authorities suggested, he had simply brought contaminated clothing on the trip. But this explanation satisfied few people. The contamination was not evenly distributed across all his clothing. It appeared concentrated on specific items. Moreover, Dubinina had no connection to nuclear facilities whatsoever. Yet her clothing also showed elevated readings. The appearance of some bodies added further fuel to military accident theories. When found, several victims displayed an unusual orange-brown discoloration of the skin. Medical examiners noted this specifically in their reports. The skin had taken on a strange tint, almost as if exposed to some chemical agent or intense thermal radiation. Combined with the fact that some clothing showed signs of burning or singeing despite being found in snow, the evidence suggested exposure to something beyond ordinary environmental factors. Soviet weapons testing in the Ural region was not merely theoretical speculation. It was documented historical fact. The Mayak facility, located approximately 250 kilometers south of the incident site, had been operational since 1948. This massive complex produced plutonium for the Soviet nuclear weapons program and had already been the site of one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. In 1957, just 2 years before the Dyatlov incident, an explosion at Mayak released massive quantities of radioactive material across the region in what became known as the Kishtym disaster. The Soviet government concealed the Kishtym accident from the world for decades. Entire villages were evacuated. Hundreds of square kilometers were contaminated. If authorities could hide an accident of that magnitude, covering up a smaller incident involving 9 hikers would present no significant challenge whatsoever. Beyond nuclear testing, the Ural Mountains served as a testing corridor for various military technologies. Missile tests were conducted regularly from facilities in the region. New rocket designs were launched across these remote territories where few civilians traveled, and where secrecy could be maintained with relative ease. The trajectory of these tests sometimes passed directly over the northern Urals, the exact area where the Dyatlov group had been hiking. Some researchers have proposed that the hikers may have inadvertently witnessed a missile test gone wrong. The orange spheres reported by multiple witnesses could have been rocket boosters or warheads in flight. If a missile had malfunctioned, releasing its payload prematurely or scattering debris across the mountainside, it would explain both the lights and the subsequent military presence. It might also explain the rapid, chaotic flight from the tent. If the hikers saw a missile approaching or witnessed an explosion nearby, their panic would be entirely understandable. Chemical weapons testing presents another possibility. The Soviet military conducted experiments with various chemical agents during this period, testing their effects in cold weather conditions. If the hikers had been exposed to an aerosol release of some chemical compound, it could account for the unusual behavior, the skin discoloration, and the apparent confusion that led them away from their shelter. Some chemical agents can cause disorientation, panic, and irrational behavior. Exposure to such substances in sub-zero temperatures would be swiftly fatal once victims were separated from protective shelter. The government's handling of the case reinforces suspicions of military involvement. The investigation, which began with relative thoroughness, was abruptly closed in May of 1959. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was ordered to conclude the case with a vague finding of death by hypothermia caused by an unknown compelling force. Ivanov himself later admitted, decades after the fact, that he had been pressured to close the investigation despite unresolved questions. He claimed that his superiors had demanded the case be concluded and that certain evidence be excluded from the final report. The area around Paradoxical was declared off limits for 3 years following the incident. Official explanations cited avalanche danger, but locals knew these mountains well and found the closure suspicious. The restricted zone seemed designed to prevent people from discovering something rather than protecting them from natural hazards. Military patrols reportedly enforced the closure, turning back anyone who attempted to enter the region. Documents related to the case were classified and sealed in archives. When portions were finally released decades later, key pages were missing. Witness testimonies had been removed. Photographs were absent. The radiation analysis reports existed, but details about methodology and comparative readings were conspicuously incomplete. This pattern of selective information release is consistent with cases involving state secrets rather than straightforward accidents. Yet for all the suggestive evidence, definitive proof of military involvement remains elusive. The radiation detected, while above normal, was not at levels that would necessarily cause acute symptoms or death. The orange spheres could have mundane explanations. Ball lightning, though rare in winter, is not impossible. Rocket tests did occur in the region, but documented launches from that period do not align precisely with February 1st. The skin discoloration noted in autopsy reports might result from natural decomposition processes altered by extreme cold. Bodies freeze and thaw as temperatures fluctuate, and this can produce unusual changes in tissue appearance. The burning or singeing of clothing could come from proximity to the campfire the hikers had built at the forest edge, with charred fragments later scattered across the snow. Even the military presence at the scene admits alternative explanations. Given the political climate of the Cold War, any unusual death scenario involving multiple citizens would attract security services' attention. The KGB routinely investigated accidents to rule out sabotage, espionage, or other security threats. Their presence does not automatically indicate guilt or complicity. The rapid case closure might reflect simple bureaucratic pressure rather than sinister cover-up. Soviet authorities were often more concerned with maintaining the appearance of control than with pursuing complex investigations. An unsolved mystery reflected poorly on state competence. Better to close the case with an ambiguous conclusion than admit complete ignorance. What remains is a collection of fragments, pieces that suggest something beyond a simple hiking accident, but never quite assemble into definitive proof of military involvement. The orange lights in the sky, witnessed by multiple independent observers, indicate something unusual occurred that night. The radiation traces, the military investigators, the abrupt closure, the sealed documents all point toward secrets being protected. But secrets can be mundane as often as they are sinister. The space between suggestive evidence and conclusive proof remains frustratingly wide, leaving us to wonder whether these 9 young people were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, witnesses to something they were never meant to see. In the frozen darkness of the northern Urals, where the wind carries whispers of things best left unnamed, there exists a theory about the Dyatlov Pass incident that refuses to die. It lives in the space between reason and primal fear, between what we know and what we dare not admit might be possible. This is the story of the creature theory, the explanation that captured imaginations worldwide while making scientists shake their heads in disbelief. The Mansi people had walked these mountains for countless generations before Russian explorers ever set foot on the frozen slopes. They knew the forests and the peaks with an intimacy born of survival. And they knew something else, too. They knew to avoid certain places when darkness fell. The mountain where the Dyatlov group pitched their tent had a name in the Mansi language that settlers would later translate as Dead Mountain or Don't Go There. The indigenous hunters spoke in hushed tones about creatures that moved through the winter storms, beings that existed in the blurred boundary between myth and memory. Old men around fires described something massive and upright, covered in hair the color of old snow, with eyes that reflected firelight like a wolf's, but held an intelligence that was disturbingly human. The Mink, some called it. Others used words that translated roughly to forest giant or snowman. Western newspapers would eventually call it the Yeti, borrowing a name from Himalayan legend, though the Mansi creature stories predated any knowledge of Tibetan folklore by centuries. These were not new tales conjured to explain a tragedy. Soviet ethnographers had documented these legends decades before 1959. The stories formed part of a belief system that stretched across the indigenous cultures of Siberia, each with their own names for creatures that dwelled in the deepest wilderness. Were they simply mythological constructs meant to keep children from wandering into dangerous territory? Perhaps. But the consistency of the descriptions across vast distances and isolated communities suggested something deeper, some shared experience that had crystallized into legend. When investigators arrived at the scene and began documenting the evidence, certain details seemed to align disturbingly well with the idea of an animal attack. The tent had been torn open from the inside, the cuts made by the campers themselves in their desperation to escape. But what had driven them to such panic? Experienced hikers do not flee into deadly cold without their boots unless something has inspired absolute terror. The scene suggested not a calm evacuation, but a primal flight response, the kind triggered when a human being confronts a predator. Then, there were the footprints, those haunting tracks leading away from the tent in organized pairs, suggesting the group had left together initially. But the search parties also documented other prints in the area, impressions in the snow that did not match the boots of the victims. Some were described as unusually large, their origins never satisfactorily explained in the official reports. The photographs that survived showed prints that seemed almost human in shape, but wrong in scale, stretched and distorted in ways that made even hardened investigators pause. The true horror, however, emerged when the bodies were finally recovered and examined. Lyudmila Dubanina and Alexander Zolotaryov had died from catastrophic chest trauma, their ribs shattered with such force that the medical examiner compared the injuries to those sustained in a high-speed car crash. Dr. Boris Vozrozdeny, who performed the autopsies, stated explicitly that the force required to inflict such damage exceeded what a human being could deliver. Yet here was the impossible detail that elevated the injuries beyond ordinary explanation. The skin showed no external wounds, no bruising, no evidence of impact. The ribs had been crushed from within or through their clothing with a force that defied normal physics. Imagine, for a moment, being that medical examiner. You have seen violence in its many forms. You understand the mechanics of trauma, the predictable patterns of assault and accident. And now you hold evidence of something that matches no known category. The force of a vehicle collision applied with apparent precision, leaving the skin unbroken. What in the natural world crushes bones with such power, while leaving surface tissue intact? A bear might have the strength, but bear attacks leave marks, tears, the unmistakable evidence of claws and teeth. These bodies bore none of those signs. This is where the creature theory found its strongest foothold, in the space where medical evidence exceeded conventional explanation. Proponents pointed to accounts from other parts of the world, stories of large primates or unknown hominids that allegedly possessed immense strength. Witnesses in the Himalayas claimed the Yeti could kill a yak with a single blow. North American folklore spoke of Sasquatch throwing boulders and bending steel. Could something similar exist in the Urals, a surviving population of some massive primate species unknown to science? The theory gained traction in popular media, particularly in the West, where the Cold War had already primed audiences to believe that Soviet wilderness might harbor secrets. Books and articles explored the possibility with varying degrees of seriousness. Some researchers attempted to compile other reports from the region, searching for patterns of mysterious attacks or sightings that might corroborate the Dyatlov incident. They found scattered accounts, stories from hunters and geologists about glimpsed figures in the distance, about camps disturbed by something that walked on two legs but was not human, about sounds in the night that resembled no known animal. Picture the scene as the creature theorists imagined it unfolding. The 9 hikers settle into their tent as darkness claims the mountain. Perhaps they hear something first, a sound that does not belong to the wind or the settling snow. Movement outside, circling. The tent fabric suddenly distorts inward as something presses against it from outside, something large enough to create a bulge that terrifies everyone inside. In that moment of primal panic, knives flash and the canvas tears. They flee into the killing cold, because staying feels like certain death, because something in their deepest evolutionary memory screams predator. The group reaches the tree line and tries to organize, to create fire and shelter, but it has followed them. In the darkness beneath the cedars, it emerges. One by one or all at once, it attacks with brutal efficiency. The force of its blows crushes bones despite layers of clothing. The survivors scatter. Some try to hide in the ravine, burrowing into the snow, but you cannot hide from something that knows these mountains as its territory. The lucky ones die of hypothermia before it finds them again. It is a compelling narrative precisely because it explains the otherwise inexplicable fear. Humans do not abandon survival protocols without cause. The Dyatlov group were not novices prone to panic. They were tested hikers who had faced difficult conditions before. What could inspire experienced outdoors people to run without proper clothing into lethal cold? The creature theory offers an answer. They encountered something so threatening, so outside their framework of understanding, that instinct overrode training. But this is where the narrative, however captivating, begins to crumble under scrutiny. The investigators who spent weeks at the site, who examined every meter of snow around the tent, found no animal tracks approaching the campsite. None. In fresh snow on an exposed slope, any large creature would have left unmistakable evidence of its approach. Bears, wolves, even human intruders, all leave traces. The snow around the Dyatlov tent showed only the footprints of the victims themselves, leading away into the darkness. Furthermore, if a large predator or unknown creature had attacked the group, where was the evidence of feeding? Predators attack for territory or food. The bodies, when recovered, showed no signs of predation, no attempts at consumption. The injuries appeared almost surgical in their precision, devastating but not consistent with animal behavior. Bears maul. Wolves tear. What kind of creature kills without feeding, without leaving tracks, without any trace of its presence beyond the damage inflicted? The regional history also argued against the creature theory. The northern Urals saw regular traffic from Mansi hunters, Soviet geologists, and hiking groups. If a population of large, aggressive, unknown animals inhabited these mountains, why had there been no other attacks? Why had no bodies or physical evidence of such creatures ever been found? The Mansi legends were rich and detailed, but legends alone do not constitute evidence. Every wilderness culture has stories of mysterious beings, and these stories serve social and psychological functions that have nothing to do with biological reality. Scientists pointed out that unknown large mammals are extraordinarily rare discoveries in the modern era. The possibility of a breeding population of massive primates existing in a region under regular human observation, leaving no bones, no bodies, no definitive tracks or scat, strains credibility to the breaking point. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the creature theory offered only circumstantial connections and unanswered questions. Yet, the theory persists, and perhaps that persistence reveals something important about the human psyche. We want to believe that wilderness still holds mysteries, that the map has blank spaces where unknown things dwell. The creature theory transforms a tragic accident or inexplicable disaster into a story of encounter, of humanity brushing against something ancient and other. It gives meaning to meaningless death, structure to chaos. The truth is likely more mundane and more tragic. Something created tremendous fear in 9 experienced hikers on that February night. Fear powerful enough to drive them into the snow without adequate protection. Whether that something was an avalanche, military testing, infrasound-induced panic, or some other natural phenomenon, it killed them as efficiently as any monster. The real terror is not that unknown creatures stalk the wilderness, but that nature itself, indifferent and vast, can extinguish human life with casual brutality. We search for the monster because the alternative, that random confluence of natural forces can destroy us, is somehow more frightening than teeth and claws in the darkness. The human mind seeks simple explanations. We want our mysteries to have singular causes, clear villains, definitive answers. But the truth about what happened on the slopes of Catastrophes may be far more complex and, in its own way, more terrifying. Because sometimes the greatest horrors are not the work of secret weapons or supernatural forces, but the cruel mathematics of compounding failures, where one small mistake cascades into catastrophe, where survival slips through desperate fingers, not because of any single monster, but because of any single monster, but because everything that could go wrong did go wrong in the worst possible sequence. The most compelling modern theory embraces this uncomfortable complexity. It suggests that the Dyatlov tragedy was not the result of one dramatic event, but a perfect storm of factors that transformed a manageable situation into a death sentence. This theory, developed through decades of investigation and supported by a growing consensus of experts, paints a picture that is both rational and heartbreaking. It shows us 9 experienced hikers who made reasonable decisions that became unreasonable in hindsight, who fought desperately for survival, and who died not because they were foolish, but because nature has no mercy for even small errors when conditions align against you. The sequence likely began with a triggering event sometime during the night of February 1st, 1959. The tent stood pitched on the exposed slope, the 9 members of the group settling in for the night, despite the less-than-ideal location. Igor Dyatlov had made the decision to camp there, rather than moving approximately 1.5 kilometers further to the tree line. It was a choice that seemed reasonable at the time, setting up camp in the remaining daylight rather than fumbling in darkness, gaining altitude for the next day's journey. A minor tactical decision that would prove catastrophic. The trigger itself remains debated, but several possibilities fit the evidence. One theory suggests a small slab avalanche or snowslide. Not a massive avalanche that would have buried the tent completely, but a smaller event. Perhaps snow accumulated on the slope above their tent throughout the evening, building pressure. The wind howling across the mountain could have created a cornice that eventually gave way. The hikers might have heard a deep rumbling sound, felt vibrations through the snow beneath them, sensed the mountain shifting above them in the darkness. Another possibility involves falling ice. The slope above them could have released chunks of ice that struck the tent or landed nearby with enough force to create genuine terror. Imagine lying in your sleeping bag in complete darkness, exhausted from the day's journey, when suddenly something slams into the canvas above you with devastating force. You cannot see what hit you. You cannot know if something larger is coming. You only know that the mountain has become hostile, and you are trapped in fabric walls. Some researchers have proposed an even more unusual trigger involving infrasound. Under specific conditions, wind moving across certain mountain formations can create low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of conscious hearing. These waves can induce feelings of extreme anxiety, panic, even terror in people exposed to them. The sensation is described as an overwhelming dread with no apparent source, a primal fear that bypasses rational thought. If the wind conditions that night produced such frequencies, the hikers might have experienced sudden, inexplicable panic while lying in their tent. Regardless of the specific trigger, the evidence clearly shows what happened next. They cut their way out of the tent from the inside, not through the entrance, but through the fabric itself. This single fact tells us volumes about their mental state. These were experienced hikers who knew the value of their equipment, who understood that a tent meant survival in these conditions. Yet they took knives to the canvas in multiple places, creating large slashes through which they evacuated into the freezing night. The critical question is why? The multi-factor theory suggests they believed remaining in the tent posed a greater danger than fleeing into the night. Whether they feared an avalanche about to bury them, falling ice that might crush them, or simply experienced overwhelming panic, they made a calculation in seconds. Get out now or die inside. They chose to get out. This decision would have seemed rational in that moment of terror. The problem was what happened next. Because once 9 people in various states of undress stood outside their tent at night, in temperatures approaching -30 degrees Celsius, with wind chill making it far worse, they faced a situation that was immediately life-threatening. Here the cascade truly began. The darkness was nearly absolute. The wind was ferocious. Several members wore only underwear or light clothing. They could not immediately return to the tent because whatever had driven them out might still pose a threat, or perhaps they feared the tent had been damaged beyond use. They needed to put distance between themselves and the perceived danger. They needed shelter. They needed fire. The group moved downslope toward the tree line, following the natural terrain. This makes sense. Trees meant potential shelter from the wind, fuel for fire, and a more protected location. The walk was approximately 1.5 kilometers, and they did it largely in their socks or barefoot. The snow would have been hard-packed in some places, softer in others. Each step would have been agony. The cold would have been attacking their extremities with vicious efficiency. We know they reached the tree line because that is where the first 2 bodies were found. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko died beneath a large cedar tree, and the evidence shows they had attempted to build a fire. They gathered branches. They created a small fire that burned long enough to char some of the wood. But a fire that small in those conditions could not generate enough heat to save them. Hypothermia was already shutting down their bodies. The fire would have felt like salvation, but it was too little, too late. Both men were found in their underwear, their hands showing signs of having climbed the cedar tree to break off branches. They fought to live. They died anyway. Meanwhile, other members of the group made different decisions in their desperation. Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin attempted to return to the tent. Their bodies were found at intervals along the route, back up slope, spaced hundreds of meters apart. Each had been trying to reach the shelter and equipment that could save their lives. Each succumbed to hypothermia before completing the journey. Slobodin had a small skull fracture, possibly from falling on the ice in his weakened state. They died within reach of salvation, their bodies pointing back toward the tent like frozen signposts marking a failed retreat. But the most severely injured members of the group tell a different and more disturbing part of the story. Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Zolotaryov, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol were found months later in a ravine, approximately 75 meters from the cedar tree. These 4 suffered the catastrophic injuries that fueled the most extreme theories. Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her facial tissue. She and Zolotaryov had major chest fractures. Thibault-Brignol had severe skull damage. The force required to create these injuries was compared to that of a car crash. The multi-factor theory provides a logical explanation. After some members died at the cedar, and others attempted the return to the tent, the remaining hikers likely sought better shelter. In the darkness, and in their hypothermic state, they fell into a ravine. Perhaps they were trying to dig a snow cave, or den in the side of the ravine when the snow collapsed. Perhaps they simply could not see the drop-off in the dark and walked over the edge. A fall of several meters onto rocks and ice could easily produce the trauma documented in the autopsy reports. The missing soft tissue can be explained by the months the body spent in a stream at the bottom of the ravine. Decomposition and scavenging animals would naturally remove eyes, tongues, and other soft facial features. This is standard post-mortem degradation, not evidence of anything sinister. The bodies were not found until May, meaning they lay in that ravine through months of freeze and thaw cycles. This layered explanation accounts for the different types of injuries across the group. The first 2 died of hypothermia at the fire. 3 more died of hypothermia trying to return to the tent. 4 died from a combination of trauma from the ravine fall and subsequent hypothermia. Each subset of the group made different survival decisions, and each faced different fatal consequences. The scattered locations of the bodies make sense when viewed through this timeline. The group fragmented based on different assessments of how to survive. Some prioritized immediate warmth through fire. Some prioritized returning to equipment. Some sought shelter in terrain features. None of these decisions was wrong, in principle. All of them failed in execution because the margin for error was already gone the moment they left the tent. The seemingly contradictory evidence resolves when we abandon the search for a single cause. Why were some bodies more clothed than others? Because those who died first at the cedar had their clothes removed by those still living, who desperately needed additional insulation. Why was the tent found with supplies still inside, suggesting no panic? Because after cutting their way out, they likely intended to return once the immediate threat passed, not realizing hypothermia would make return impossible. Why did some bodies show signs of struggle while others seemed peaceful? Because hypothermia kills in stages, sometimes causing agitation and confusion, sometimes simply shutting the body down into unconsciousness. This theory has gained support from mountaineering experts who recognize the pattern. Small triggering event creates panic. Panic creates a hasty decision to evacuate. Evacuation in inadequate clothing creates immediate hypothermia risk. Hypothermia impairs judgment and physical capability. Impaired judgment leads to fragmented group decisions. Fragmentation reduces collective survival chances. Each factor feeds into the next, like dominoes falling in sequence. What makes this explanation perhaps the most tragic is that the initial situation was survivable. If they had remained calm, investigated the threat carefully, or even if they had fled but immediately returned to the tent once they realized the danger was not imminent, most, or all of them, could have lived. The gap between survival and death was measured in minutes and meters, not miles. This is the horror that resonates most deeply. Not alien intervention or secret weapons, but the recognition that experienced, intelligent people can find themselves in a cascade of circumstances where every reasonable action leads toward death. The Dyatlov group did not die because they were incompetent. They died because survival in extreme environments requires not just skill, but also perfect luck. And their luck ran out in the worst possible way on that February night. The multiple factor theory forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about wilderness survival and human vulnerability. We are never as safe as we believe. The line between a challenging camping trip and a fatal disaster can be crossed in heartbeats. One wrong turn, one moment of panic, one environmental factor we did not anticipate, and the cascade begins. For 9 hikers on a Ural mountain slope in 1959, that cascade transformed a winter expedition into a slow-motion catastrophe from which there was no escape, no villain to fight, no enemy to defeat, only the cruel arithmetic of compounding failures in the cold mathematics of death. Even after 6 decades of investigation, after countless expeditions and theories, after official inquiries and unofficial obsessions, certain pieces of the Dyatlov puzzle remain stubbornly beyond explanation. These are not mysteries that dissolve when one theory or another is accepted. They persist, silent and defiant, no matter which lens we look through. The pattern of injuries stands among the most troubling. Ludmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, and others suffered massive internal trauma without corresponding external wounds. Ribs shattered like twigs, skulls fractured with surgical precision, yet their skin remained largely intact. One medical examiner compared the force required to a high-speed car collision. Yet these bodies lay scattered across pristine snow, far from any cliff or avalanche path that could explain such violence. Then there is Dubinina herself, found face down in the ravine stream, missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her facial tissue. Some attribute this to natural decomposition and scavenging, yet the specificity haunts investigators still. The missing soft tissue suggests something more deliberate, more targeted than random predation. The orange coloring of the skin, noted in official autopsy reports, has never been adequately explained. Chemical exposure, radiation, some unknown environmental factor, all have been proposed, none confirmed. Perhaps most puzzling is the tent itself. 9 experienced winter hikers fled into lethal cold wearing only socks, slashing their way out from within. Yet, they made absolutely no attempt to retrieve boots, coats, or supplies that meant the difference between survival and death. Whatever drove them out must have been immediate and overwhelming, a threat that made hypothermia preferable to remaining inside. And those final photographs. Frames from cameras found with the bodies show unclear shapes, strange lights, images that resist interpretation, even with modern enhancement technology. Were they capturing their doom, or simply damaged film, artifacts of moisture and time? We see what we want to see, or fear to see. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the case after pressure from families who had waited lifetimes for answers. Their conclusion was Avalanche, a natural disaster triggered by wind and snowpack instability. The theory offered closure, a rational explanation that let officials close the file with bureaucratic satisfaction. But the families were not satisfied. Neither were the investigators who had spent years in those mountains. An avalanche cannot explain the radiation, the pattern of who died where and how, the orange skin, the methodical removal of tissue. It is an answer that raises more questions than it settles, a box checked rather than a mystery solved. This is what makes Dyatlov Pass more than just an unsolved case. It has become something larger, more symbolic. It represents the edge of human understanding, that border country where evidence meets speculation and neither can cross into certainty. We have footprints, but not the feet that made them. We have photographs, but cannot see what they captured. We have bodies, but not the story of their final terror. The Mountain of the Dead earned its name long before 9 students chose it for their expedition. Local indigenous people avoided it, spoke of it as a place where natural law bent in strange directions. Now it holds 9 more reasons for its reputation, 9 mysteries frozen into legend. In their final moments, those hikers knew something. They saw or heard or felt something that drove them from safety into annihilation. That knowledge died with them in the snow, and the mountain keeps it still. We circle it with theories and investigations, building scaffolds of explanation around an absence we cannot fill. The dead cannot tell us, and the living cannot know. Some mysteries, it seems, choose to remain mysteries. The Dyatlov Pass endures not as a question waiting for an answer, but as a reminder that some answers may forever lie beyond our reach, buried in snow and time and the unknowable darkness of that long-ago winter night. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.